Hi there, I thought I'd share a short video reflection about the scripture readings that have been suggested for this Sunday, which is going to be the second Sunday after Pentecost. And the scripture readings that I'm going to be reflecting on are from the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verse 1 to 9, and from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 9, verses 9 to 13, and then verses 18 to 26. So feel free to pause the video and have a read of those and then start the video again. In the reading from the Jewish scripture from the book of Genesis, God calls Abram and Sarai and their household to go and live among the Canaanites. And the interesting thing here is that they're not led to fight the Canaanites. God doesn't tell them to conquer the Canaanites or eliminate the Canaanites or to convert them or to have nothing to do with them. This is different to what's said in the following books when Moses and Joshua are leading Sarai and Abram's descendants. When this family enters the land, the boundary is marked by a sacred place, a special tree, and there's no impression that this tree should be removed, as it is said it should be later on in Israel's story. They move about as guests in the land, and they live among other people who have different practices. Later on in the time of Jesus, Jewish people are also having to navigate how they will live among other nations, because they're colonized by Rome, and Roman people follow a different way of life to them. The Jewish people in this time have been impacted by influence by Greek and Roman society for a long time, so there's a lot of debate about what is the best way for Jewish people to live in this situation, and there's disagreement among Jewish people at this time about that. Tax officials make a living by collecting money and resources for Rome. So they have a close relationship with Roman people, and that means that they're entwined with people who aren't living the Jewish way of life. And they're becoming wealthy off the troubles of their own people as well, helping to keep them under the control of Rome. When one of the tax collectors, Matthew, begins to follow Jesus, Jesus ends up eating with a heap of tax collectors. He reclines at the table, which is very intimate. This would have raised questions. Does Jesus know who these people are and how they make their living, how they're providing this food? Is the food being served even appropriate for Jewish people to eat? You would also have people standing around in the room or at the doorway in the atrium, because around a wealthy household it was expected that even if you weren't at the table, you might get something later on. Other people standing nearby might get something to eat. Other people who are standing outside in the courtyard might get something to eat as well. There'd be lots of people that were connected to a large, wealthy household. In this scene, some of the people who were around but not reclining at the table are the Pharisees, and it says that the Pharisees are unhappy. But even if they are distancing themselves from the dinner table, and even if they're not reclining at the table, they're still there, they're still present, and they're in the conversation. They might disagree with Jesus about what he's doing, but they're still talking about their disagreement. Bringing people together at a meal can be complicated. Different people eat different things in different ways. Different people have different ideas about when cutlery must be used and when you can use your hands. Then there's the issue of double dipping. And of course, people have different ideas about what's appropriate to talk about at the dinner table. I'm wondering whether you have any experiences of an awkward meal or experiences of clashes at the dinner table. After this scene, a religious leader, a leader in the Jewish synagogue, humbles himself and comes and asks Jesus for help because his daughter's sick. He invites Jesus to his house, even though he knows that Jesus has just been at the house of tax collectors, reclining and eating with them. On the way, there's also someone else who's in need of treatment, and she's been unwell for many years. She's been bleeding for 12 years, and this would have meant that people treated her as unclean. It doesn't mean that she's sinful, but it would mean that she's not allowed to go to the temple, and that anybody she comes into contact with would not be allowed to go to the temple. So she would have had to stay away from people, and she's not supposed to be there in the crowd, because it would be understood that she'd be making other people in the crowd unclean if she touched them. She would also be feeling really weak from the constant loss of blood, and this might have meant that she'd not been able to ever have children. It might have meant that she had no place in any household, and that no one was looking after her welfare. But she believes that she can be healed if she can just touch Jesus, which should make him ritually unclean as well, if he isn't already considered unclean from eating with the tax collectors. When she goes to touch his cloak, Jesus turns and sees her, sees what she's doing. And he tells her that her faith has made her well. By having the faith to risk getting herself and Jesus in a lot of trouble, she's actually healed herself. By deciding that she should be able to be part of society, by deciding that she should be able to have contact with others, she's healed herself. Rather than contaminating Jesus, his wellness has instead spread into her. This doesn't mean that this woman's body is just healed. It also means that she can be part of society again. There's a social healing that happens as well. This leaves, I think, a dilemma for the synagogue leader whose daughter is still unwell and still waiting for treatment. Jesus has now not only been eating with tax collectors, who are generally presumed to be ritually unclean, Jesus has also had contact with someone who's been continually bleeding, who is definitely unclean, and everybody's seen this happen. For this man's daughter to be treated, she is going to have to allow somebody into his house who is publicly known to be ritually unclean. It turns out that while Jesus has been attending to this interrupter, the little girl has died. The interruption has had a serious cost. The death means that the household has now also been made ritually unclean by the presence of a corpse. At this point, we should know that Jesus is not going to be deterred. He restores the girl to life, and he does so by holding her hand. Jesus is not afraid of becoming ritually unclean because of who he comes into contact with. Talk about ritual uncleanness might seem strange in our society, but I think that there are still groups of people who are not considered to be good company. I think it depends on the circles we're moving in who falls into the category of being undesirable. But the practice of Jesus encourages us to make friendships across those boundaries and to welcome people in the church despite the separating boundaries that exist in our wider society. We may not make ourselves popular by doing this. People may consider us to be confusing or to be hypocritical, but it may contribute to healing some of the divisions in our society, and it may be part of bringing some folks back into touch with the wider community.